Yes. So, welcome everybody. Let me introduce, first of all, our guest for today, Brototi Roy. She is an ecological economist and a political ecologist, and she worked as postdoc at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, which many of you know as one of the epicenters of degrowth research and debates all over Europe. She is also co-president of the Research and Degrowth Initiative, which is actually one of the headquarters of degrowth research in Europe, and also co-founder of the Degrowth in India initiative. We invited her because she's an expert on the topic of degrowth within the context of the debate about global north, global south divides, if we can generally introduce it this way. And the reason why we invited her is that this debate, it's one, first of all, of the most prominent and most discussed issues in debates around degrowth. What does it mean for the global south? What does it mean for the relations between global south and global north? But it's also one of the most relatable to the issue of extended urbanization. So the impact that urbanization has on the planet at large, areas that we would not define as urban in the first place, but that in some way might be connected to what's happening in more dense urban environments. Think about mines, for example, or waste landfills, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so this is the reason why we are very happy to have her expertise in this session. And with all the speakers, we asked them to talk about what they do, their research. So I asked Brototi to give a presentation of about half an hour, 40 minutes. And after that, we will have discussion. I will moderate this discussion, and I invite you all to write your questions on the chat. I will try to, as much as I can, to take that question on stage and help the conversation. So, Brototi, I would give you the words right away, and you can share your screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here. Let me try to share the screen. Yeah. Okay. So the topic or the theme is not a very academic theme, but more like a reflection, more like thinking about degrowth and what were the trajectories that got me to degrowth, and what are the 3 key ways in which I see why degrowth is something which could be spoken about everywhere, could be spoken about from every place. And I would try to explain that a little bit as we go through the discussion today. But before that, I wanted to tell a little bit about how I came about this idea of this concept of degrowth, and what were my ways of engaging with it, to also see maybe if there is some resonance of that with all of you here. So as Federico mentioned, I started my engagement with degrowth while I was still in India, and I was doing my master's in Delhi. And we had a discussion. We had a 3-day seminar on titled Growth, Degrowth, or Green Growth ? What does it mean for India's political economy? And after that discussion, it just felt there were quite a few of us who were interested to understand more and more about socio-ecological justice and equity, and how that plays in the Indian context. So this was in 2014, 2015 that I started organizing discussion sessions. I started organizing with what are the realities we see in the capital of the country, and what are the realities we see in other parts of India, and what are the ways in which there is certain section of the society, even within the country, which is in this trajectory of exploitative growth, and what does it mean for the rest of the country. So that was kind of my starting point for thinking and discussing degrowth in India. And then I moved to Barcelona in 2017, and I became quite heavily involved in this association called Research and Degrowth. I had first come as a participant of a summer school, I think around 8 years back. And somehow the discussions kept making me reflect and think more and more about what is happening in India and what are the ways in which there could be potentialities of building solidarities and alliances within the different movements in India who are fighting for justice and equity. And during the course of my PhD, I was doing all my degrowth work on the side because my PhD was focusing more on environmental justice movements and climate justice movements with a focus on coal. And this also provided a very interesting way of looking at what degrowth means in the majority world or in the global south, because I could see that there were certain sections of the society who were very open to the idea of degrowth even without knowing the term, and were not the let's say middle class or upper middle class in urban areas, but rather the people in rural parts of the country who had seen firsthand what it means when you use an agenda of economic growth or rise in GDP to solve all the problems. And so I never used the term degrowth when I was in these contexts, but the way they explained to me what was happening, the way they explained to me what happens when a mining company comes and what are the false promises of growth and development and employment and reduction in poverty, and where exactly would the money then go. So that was where this idea that what we are talking about in Europe and that there is a divide between what is happening in the rest of the world became more and more not such a big divide anymore. So these were kind of my formative years of trying to grapple with this idea of degrowth. And then since then, I'm also quite heavily involved with a voluntary group called the Support Group for providing support to the international conferences. And we have a conference which is happening next week in Pontevedra, a degrowth conference in association with the European Society for Ecological Economics. And all these different meetings or all these different workshops and sessions and discussions made me realize more and more that this idea of degrowth, which first, as always, it was a term which was built as an activist slogan or as a provocation to stop thinking of economic growth and to change and to reimagine the ways in which we understand what is well-being, in which we understand what is prosperity, in which we understand what are the ways in which we can live happily and connected with the nature within the planetary boundary. So these ideas and discussions are something which more and more, as we try to go away from just looking at the GDP numbers, or as we try to go away from just looking at climate models, we see that there is more resonance with it depending on, based on any part of the world. And in recent years, as you might know, there has been a lot of more engagement of different kinds of people with degrowth. And here I wanted to share with all of you this international degrowth network, which has started, and invite anyone who is interested to be more engaging or more associating with the degrowth community at large, that it's open for anyone. You could be an individual, you could be a collective, to join and to think together about what does degrowth mean and how can we work towards it. So in the recent past, there has been a lot of discussion around degrowth, and it is somehow coming into the mainstream. There is popular pieces, media articles. A couple of days ago, there was an article published in Harvard Business Review, out of all places, talking about why we should be thinking of degrowth. There have been many articles, some in favor and some being quite critical of degrowth. But it is without doubt that more and more people are trying to engage with the idea or trying to understand what exactly does it mean. I also wanted to share some resources which are not the very popular ones, but are nonetheless interesting. That there are a couple of new books. One which just came out last month. It's an open access book by Manchester University Press. And the reason why I'm bringing these things are because we all know the usual big names in degrowth, no? But it's also important to look at different ways and different topics that different people are engaging with when you're talking about degrowth, because it's not just about looking at the economy. Because if we try to bring in a holistic view of what is the economy and how in ecological economics, it's the main difference between ecological economics and environmental economics is that in ecological economics, you see economy which is embedded within society, which is then embedded within nature. So every decision that is taken about the environment is a decision which is an economic decision, and vice versa. Every decision which is an economic decision in the end would impact the environment. So these are like the main assumptions of ecological economics and political ecology. So to see that it is not only looking at very macro or micro indicators, but looking at all the different ways in which economic decision making and economic policies affect the ways in which we relate to each other and the nature, is something to think of when we're thinking about degrowth, because it is not only about the demand supply numbers or the aggregate rise and falls. There are also, other than books, and I will just, I think, share one more slide on some resources and then talk more about the reflections. There are also comic books for people who are interested, which is also open access, and documentaries which are being made to question what does it mean to live within planetary boundaries, and why is it so important to know that if we agree that infinite growth in a finite planet is impossible, what are the ways then we go forward with it? There are different streams, and degrowth is only one of them, but there are also lots of people who believe in this eco-modernist agenda, and what are the ways in which that would not lead to socio-ecological justice and equity. So there are different resources which you can look at if you're interested later on. And then we come to this very simple, very easy definition of degrowth for me. And this diagram is basically that what degrowth talks about is not just looking at GDP numbers. And this is where the idea of speaking about it or reflecting on it from anywhere and everywhere makes sense. Because one of the first questions that I guess get asked when I'm talking about degrowth in the Indian or in the context of the majority world is that, but what about healthcare and education and basic needs for the people? And what degrowth talks about is not that every place needs to reduce its consumption, but that we need to rethink the ways in which consumption and production is happening. So nowhere in degrowth literature, or nobody who talks about degrowth says that no, people in India should not have access to basic healthcare or education or basic infrastructure. But rather, when we start looking at the realities, or when we start looking at the ways in which this rise in GDP is being translated into reality, then you do not see that the money going into leading to reduction in poverty or into leading to electrifying houses. What you see is always that the rise in GDP is used as a proxy and continues to be used as a proxy. And the way in which you hide behind that proxy is by saying, but no, these countries require a rise in GDP because of unemployment, because of poverty, because of lack of basic access, lack of access to basic amenities. But this is not the reality. And the way in which we can understand that this is not the reality, and this is kind of my first reflection, is when we start looking at inequality. And when we start looking at inequality, it doesn't matter where you're based. Inequality globally is continuing to rise at a rapid and at a very dangerous rate. At a rate in which it is been magnified more during the pandemic, which makes you think something about what is happening in the global economic system. So if you look at the clip from the clip at the bottom part, it's from 2 years ago, and it was a report published called Inequality Kills, which said that there is at least one person dying every 4 seconds, which is already a conservative number, which is based on lack of access to healthcare, gender-based violence, hunger, and climate breakdown. And this is looking at it from a, so there are multiple ways in which you look at how inequality is measured now. And one of the more recent ways of measuring inequality is looking at it from a multidimensional perspective, where you see even more that the people who not only have more monetary wealth, but also more access, and the vast majority who do not, keeps on getting increased at very rapid rates. And this is important, I show the global picture here, but this is important to know that this is happening not just in a certain section of the world, but this is happening globally. And here I come back to India and talk about it a little bit, because this is the context I know best. Now, what we call in India is that we have this idea of the billionaire Raj, which is basically the rule of the billionaires, or the rule of the rich. And it links very closely. So there is a very close link with the ruling class, so the political ruling class and the billionaires, and this idea of crony capitalism, and how the ways in which there is large parts of finance, infrastructure, real estate, and investments which is being owned and controlled by the millionaires and the billionaires, and then this in the end gets translated to rise in GDP. So these are the things which are important to keep in mind. So the hypothesis, or so the assumption, that countries from the majority world require GDP growth doesn't hold true, because in the end you see that the ones who are getting the benefits are not the people who need it, but this political economic elite of the countries. And then I show this graph that so if you look at the top 15 countries with the highest number of billionaires, you see some of the usual suspects, but you also see some of the not so usual suspects. You see India at the top, at the third position, and the second column is called change year over year. So from 2023 to 2024, India added 84 new billionaires. At the same time, while there was a rapid rise in joblessness or unemployment, and a starking rise in inflation. So what does it mean? Where is the money going? Who is benefiting and who is not benefiting? So this is one way to think about it, no? Looking at socioeconomic inequality, looking at multidimensional inequality. And then the other way to look at it is then linking with looking at socio-ecological injustices and socio-ecological conflicts. And here I show you a paper which was published a couple of years ago, looking at forest cover, or looking at deforestation. And they did a spatial analysis for 19 years, from 2000 to 2019, and found that the top 4 countries with the highest deforestation or highest forest loss were Indonesia, Brazil, Ghana, and Suriname. So let's go back to the last slide and look at where do these countries stand in the list of billionaires, in the list of ranking of the number of billionaires. You see Brazil and Indonesia both in the top 15. So then the way to think of it, or the way in which I think of it, is is to follow the money, is to follow the materials, is to follow the injustices, and then see the linkages. And it becomes much more clearer when we look at it this way. So who are the people who are benefiting from socio-environmental degradation and injustices, while at the same time the GDP continues to rise? Or there is this notion that the GDP rise or economic growth is going to solve all the issues. And the more we start looking at the numbers, the more we start going deeper into what is being calculated and what is being left unsaid or left aside, the more we become aware of how the global economic system works, and how the global economic system works with this idea of ecological unequal exchange or unequal exchange, this idea that for the global system to work, which is inherently a capitalist system, there would always need to be certain sections of the society and certain parts of the geography which would be sacrificed, or which would not have any cost. So no labor or environment cost, no labor or resource cost. And this was done before with colonialism, and now is being done with these different new neo-colonial processes. But it is the same logic, that there are certain sections of the society and certain places which do not have value like this, and which can be used to keep on accumulating capital. And this is done through dispossession, this is done through marginalization, and this is done through this discourse that we still need growth, and growth is going to be the everything is going to be fine mantra. So these are the main reflections when we try to look at the global imperial economy and the ways in which then degrowth needs to be spoken about in every context. And then I wanted to focus a little bit more about looking at the players, looking at the stakeholders, looking at the companies and collectives and individuals who benefit from this. And I wanted to share with you this resource called the Environmental Justice Atlas, which does mapping of different kinds of environmental justice movement. And excuse me. And this was the atlas which I am quite familiar with, because I did my PhD with this atlas. And it looks at how there are like certain movements or certain companies which result in environmental justice conflicts in different parts of the world. So this is one particular case of Chevron, but you can look at multiple different companies which have this same modus operandi of going to different places and not taking into account what are the people's wishes, not taking into account what are the ways in which those areas would, like, what are the ways in which the socioeconomic structures or systems of those areas work, and continuing to extract and continuing to dispossess people, all in the name or all in the narrative, but that this is good because we are generating money, we are generating we are resulting, or we are allowing for rise in GDP, which in the end would then translate for you to have jobs, would then translate for you to have better access to amenities. So this idea, which in economics you call the trickle-down effect, this idea that as long as there is money being generated, in the end, everyone is going to benefit. And time again, this atlas and a lot of other resources show that this is simply not true. There are certain things which cannot, I mean, there are most things which just do not get trickled down at all, and it stays within a certain section of the socioeconomic and political elite. And so this is kind of the second point, the second reflection that I want to bring in, that then these movements which are against these extractive companies, or these movements which try to fight against big corporations with the promise of economic growth and development, can actually be thought of as degrowth in practice. And this is an idea which I haven't come up on my own. This is an idea which Joan Martinez Alier, who is one of the founders of the discipline of ecological economics, speaks about. That if you look at environmental justice, which are saying no, there are certain things that you cannot do to a place, that you cannot do to people, and you're resisting that, and you're resisting this idea of economic growth and development, you are in a sense speaking with or agreeing to what degrowth is talking about. So this is the second way in which the idea of degrowth can then be translated into different places. And this idea of degrowth in practice, or these ideas of why people protest against certain projects, is this idea of incommensurability of value. And the idea of incommensurability of value is, if some of you are more familiar with this term of weak sustainability or strong sustainability. So the idea of weak sustainability is that you can measure everything in monetary terms. So for example, if you are cutting some forest somewhere for a mining project, that could be, you could calculate how much is the cost of that in monetary terms, and you could either provide a monetary compensation, or you could be planting trees in some other place, and that would be fine. So there would be actually no degradation of sustainability. Whereas the strong sustainability theory, or the strong sustainability logic, says that this is simply not true. You cannot be destroying forests, you cannot be destroying ecosystems in some parts of the world, and then try to measure this with monetary value and say that everything is fine. There are certain things which you cannot account for in monetary terms. So this is the idea of incommensurability of value. You can think of it as one step further or one step more. For example, there are certain places which have inherent values in themselves. For example, there are certain common lands, there are certain sacred territories which can never be measured in values, because there are different ways, there are different worldviews which are attached to it. So incommensurability of value also comes into play there, to say that there is no way we will allow you to give a concrete example, mine bauxite in a mountain in the central part of India, because this has implicit links to our ways of living, and it has values of sacredness associated with it. So there is no way that, no matter the amount of money generated from mining bauxite here, and the name of the hill, if some of you are interested to know more, is called Niyamgiri. So there is no way we would allow mining in Niyamgiri, because there is no amount of money which can replace this sacred mountain for us. So these are the ways in which then this idea of degrowth becomes more commonsensical when you look at it from grassroots environmental and social movements. And finally, and this is going to be the last point, and I will end it here, is why, for me, the idea of degrowth resonates a lot, is that there have been so many thinkers, philosophers, activists that I know from the Indian context who have been fighting for these very basic principles that degrowth talks about, which is that direct democracy, autonomy, conviviality, living within our needs and not trying to overaccumulate. And I give one example here, one quote from Mahatma Gandhi. But there are many such different ideas coming from different parts of India that I'm familiar with, and talking to other people also from different parts of the world. So this idea of why we need to live in solidarity, what are the ways in which we can have autonomy over our resources, this idea of seed sovereignty, the idea of water sovereignty, these ideas are very embedded in many thinkers and activists from the majority world. And once you start talking with them, these ideas of degrowth then again becomes something which can be spoken about in different contexts. And I think these were the three main reflections that I wanted to bring forward for this discussion. First, that once we start looking at multidimensional inequalities and who are the ones who are gaining from the continuous rise in GDP as the sole measure, you see it doesn't get translated into what are the claims which are made for the continued rise in economic growth. Second, when we try to look at socio-environmental justice movements, you see there is a lot of resonance in the ways in which degrowth can be implemented or degrowth can be made into practical projects. And third, there are lots of thinkers and activists from different parts of the global south who have had same ideas that we talk about when we talk of degrowth. And this is how I imagine degrowth to be something which can be spoken about everywhere and nowhere. And with that, I stop. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Brototi. Thank you very much. First of all, I will ask you to remove the screen so we can discuss with the room. In fact, we have more than enough time. I mean, a lot of time to discuss. You gave 3 nice inputs. While people write their questions, I already saw one. I would rather start and give a reflection on this start of discussion that you just presented. So what I liked very much, especially in the first part, is that you debunked a bit this usual scheme of thinking in terms of global north, global south, in a rather paternalistic way, like global north rich, global south poor. We need to contextualize in the sense of class. And when we look at class, indeed, we see that class divisions are very marked and very evident, also within countries that we would understand as global south. You brought the example of India and China, countries with the largest amount of billionaires next to the US. We also know that these billionaires, so this top 10%, top 1% incomes in the global south emit, in terms of CO2, often 6 to 10 times more the bottom, 50%. So we know that there's an increasing inequality also within the global south. So I understand that you're suggesting that talking about degrowth in those contexts makes total sense, right? Because indeed of this, you attach it to this class inequality. So my first maybe question for you would be to reflect a bit more about the geography of this class inequality. Where are these billionaires? What are the spaces that these billionaires create? And how do we see this contrast within countries like India? Can you reflect a bit on this geography of class within the global south, and how can degrowth help us addressing this geography, or changing this geography? What is your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think that's a very good question to start the discussion with. So the idea about where is this let's say billionaire class based, globally. So when I looked at the numbers of the billionaires in India, it's quite easy to see where they're based, because they're based in they're like the 4 main capitals, 4 main big metropolitan cities, and they're mostly based there. But it's not just one person, but it's the ways in which these people have control and shares across different industries, across different sectors. And I think this is where it gets interesting. Because, for example, if we look at one particular billionaire who is also quite well known in the climate justice circles, is called Adani, or this conglomerate of Adani. This person with his different family and like different people who have shares of different parts of the conglomerate, and they own the ports, the transportation, coal mines, wind power and solar power. So it's Adani in total in India controls 30 to 40% of the infrastructure of the country. And then they also own mines in Australia, the Carmichael mine, where there have been a lot of protest against Adani, and there is this movement called Stop Adani. So the ways in which this works in the Indian context is how the capitalist class is totally in sync with the political class, and what are the different ways in which policies in the country allow for this class to keep on going ahead unchecked. I can go a little bit more into details and for example give you certain ways in which certain industries continue to flourish the way in which they do, is because they have massive tax breaks. They have special economic zones being created just for single industries. They have reduction in tariffs. They have lots of underhanded deals which go on, which allows for this to happen. And the ways in which this then works is that they are kind of in cahoots with each other. So I'm talking about this idea of crony capitalism, the way in which capitalism is super embedded in the political fabric of the country. And this is the way in which it works. If we look at it also a little bit in, let's say, the US context, you look at the fossil fuel lobby and the ways in which any real direct action against fossil fuel industry is difficult because of this linkage between the political elite and the economic elite. And so then looking at the geography becomes a little bit difficult. I think it can be done, but looking at particular spaces or particular sections where it is located becomes a bit difficult, because then you start looking at the ways in which these companies function. In many places, you also see that they have then collaborations with other companies in other parts. So it's also difficult to follow the paper trail. It's difficult to link, for example, Adani Solar Private Limited with Adani Transport Private Limited, because they would say we are two totally different entities. And if we look at the transport and the solar, we have nothing to do with each other. So in the end, these are not connected, but they're connected and they're being controlled by the same people. And I think these are the tactics which are being used to make it much more difficult to follow the ways in which this global pattern works.
Yes.
So I think this is, yeah.
No, it is very clear. I like very much the fact that when you talk about the assets that drive this capital, our infrastructures, dike, harbors, energy plants. I mean, these are it's very, very interesting also because it relates to the fact that the current class structure that you're problematizing exists on top of a type of infrastructure, a system of infrastructure that is kind of not compatible with, in many cases, with sustainable world. So that's why degrowth becomes a radical project. And in relation to this, there were three, I would like to combine three questions that were posted on the chat. They were more or less in the same direction. It's the typical one, talking about super rich, the 1 billion question of degrowth is, what is the narrative strategy that degrowth could have in order to be revolutionary in terms of capitalism and class? So somebody asks what narrative, or whether we should find a narrative that speaks to these classes, or rather whether we should focus on movements that are clearly against those classes of the super rich. Somebody else similarly asks, what is the political alignment between different groups that could give, revolutionary power to this idea of degrowth? So basically, these are questions of strategy, I would say. But I would invite you, if you can, to answer them. Perhaps I assume every context is different. So in the Indian context of such a division of wealth, and with a particular type of economic structure, so what would be the degrowth strategy there? What would be the narrative there?
Also, like very, very good questions. And also to say, before I start to say something, that I do not have all the answers. The idea is to think together for the answers.
Perfect.
But the first question about what could be the strategies, no? What could be the ways in which we can influence? I think that was the question, influence the billionaires, or what are the narratives for the billionaires?
If there will be any point even, or if there will be a strategy. So what would be the best strategy? Would be
Yeah, I think the strategy is to not try to influence the billionaires, because I don't see much hope in that. But this is not to say that there are some billionaires who understand what is at stake and are trying to think things differently. And an example which comes to mind is that of this company Patagonia, and how they have been giving away all their wealth. And so you could find some examples, no, of such people who also understand that it is not going to help anyone to hoard wealth and rather redistribute it. But I don't see that as a successful or even worthy strategy for degrowth. The strategy for degrowth for me is to keep developing more and more political will, and to keep putting more and more pressure to different, like in different levels, be it in municipal levels, be it in provincial levels, be it in state levels, be it in national levels, to try to question and to try to bring about awareness that the ways in which you are talking about economic growth is not the ways in which we are thinking of well-being or prosperity. And there are, surprisingly, slowly but surely, there is a lot of political will around these things now. To give you an example from, well, not from India, but from here, from Catalonia, there is a municipality very close to Barcelona called Girona, which contacted Research and Degrowth to write a municipal proposal for a degrowth plan. And this is a municipality which is being ruled by quite a radical left-wing party in power called COOP. And they contacted us to help them figure what are the ways in which we can think of degrowth, taking into account energy needs, taking into account water needs. If some of you know, Spain has been going through a drought situation for the last few years now. So what are the ways in which we can think of degrowth in these terms? There are also a lot of big alliances or big movements which talk about ideas of energy sovereignty or food sovereignty. And one thing which comes to mind here is the network of Via Campesinas, who have their ways of thinking about food production, about seed sovereignty. So there are different ways in which a momentum can be built, or different ways in which political will can be raised to then bring about policy changes. Then the other question which comes is, what happens after the policy changes? What are the ways in which we can ensure implementation? And this is where I see more of a struggle, because I could give you a couple of examples of such social and environmental movements bringing about policy changes, bringing about radical laws, but then in the implementation phase is where then you see the power, where you see the crony capitalism working and these laws not being followed. So that's a whole different level. But I think the first way to fight or to think of a degrowth narrative is to engage more with political bodies and engage more with like public policies.
okay. Thank you. I don't see more questions yet on the chat. I invite people to do it. I mean, please. In the meanwhile, I'll ask another one. You mentioned at one point this idea of the incommensurability of values. That's one of the core ontologies of degrowth, the fact that you cannot compare trees and cash right away. But you also mentioned the example of an example of some sort of different, more than human worldview or ontology, where some sort of animist approach where subjectivity or agency is given to non-human entities. So could you develop more that, because this is very inspiring, I think, within the degrowth debate. So what is the potential of indeed adopting a more than human ontology that gives agency to nature and things? What could be the drawbacks and what could be the advantages of this kind of point of view now?
Maybe I can explain a little bit more the example and draw from there. So this is a real example in this state in the central Indian part of India called Orissa, and there is this indigenous community called the Dongriya Kones, who had this sacred mountain called Niyamgiri, which had a lot of bauxite. And there were companies which came from outside saying that we're going to mine this bauxite. But these are also places where, so in any indigenous territory in India, or for any big public project like mining, you need to have full consent of the local village association, the local village panchayat. And the villagers came together and said that there is no way in which we would allow for this to happen. And then this went to the courts, and they won the case, and they didn't allow for the mining to happen. So this is ways in which, when you're talking about more than human, this idea of giving legal status, or this idea of giving legal entity to more than human. In this case, it was not giving legal identity to the mountain, but rather the people saying that we do not allow for this mine to come up in the mountain. But also at the same time, there are examples of giving legal entity to rivers. This has happened in New Zealand, and this has happened in India. And I think it has a lot of potential, because you look at what that river means, not just in terms of what it has, but also its significance to a lot of people, to a lot of histories, to a lot of worldviews and ways of living. So I think there it makes sense so when a river is considered sacred, what does that mean? And you see what are the ways in which, because a river is not considered sacred, you dump in a lot of toxins in the river. And I'm now thinking of one of the main sacred rivers in India called the Yamuna, which had this similar case of a lot of toxins from leather industries being dumped into the river, and now the river is just not fit for any kind of life in it. So then giving legal entities, or like giving protection to more than human, makes sense in this case, because then you're preserving something which then has both implicit and explicit links to not just the place, but also the people who have centuries of association with that place or with that geography. Then how it is done in different contexts is something to think about, because I think it doesn't make sense to have like a universal solution or a universal approaches to ways in which these things would play out. So you have to look at what are the worldviews associated with certain entities, and what are the ways in which communities or movements which are connected to that want certain kinds of legalities associated. And then it would require looking at each of them separately and trying to find ways in which it makes sense or not to provide them with some kind of legal safeguards.
Thank you. Since we don't have an unmanageable overflow of questions, I ask Joanna to maybe show or put the audio and give the next question directly. Joanna, are you there? I saw.
Yes,
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for your presentation. My question was actually on reparations. So I read this article by Schmelzer and others who argue for reparations or ecological debt, and I was wondering about your opinion on that.
No, I completely agree. I think it's the article by Schmelzer and Noshin, no?
Yeah.
That came out. Yeah. Yes, and I completely agree with that. But the thing is also, social movements have been talking about reparation, both like climate debt, colonial debt, for a very long time. And unfortunately, it doesn't get translated into, like, you don't see these, like, even in these big climate, in the COPs, you see a lot of movements or a lot of activists talking about reparation, and then in the end you never see them in the actual proceedings, you know, like they are very strategic to not use the term, because once you start calculating how much debt the North owes the South, and there have been these calculations done. I think Jason Hickel also recently wrote in a paper about how much would these numbers look like, and then also linking that with unequal exchange and how much is it that the core countries owe to the peripheries. It's a huge number, and I totally agree with the demand for reparation. I do not know exactly what are the strategies to make that happen, though.
Lisa was also asking a question after Joanna. Lisa, you can.
Hi, sorry,
yes.
I was just making a tea. Hi, Brototi, good to see you after such a long time. I was wondering, and I know we've talked about this years and years ago at some point, about going back to the people you worked with during the PhD, like what kind of like people are they, and what kind of worldview did they have specifically, and which like degrowth ideas or policies do you think they might really rally behind, or what might really resonate with them? And then from that particular example, I don't know if there's any broader lessons to be learned as to how to galvanize more people around the world. I think, I mean, not to be kind of extractivist from the global south, from the majority world to the minority world, but thinking, for example, that a lot of degrowth ideas don't seem to resonate very well with middle and working classes in Europe, I feel like. So I don't know, like, I'm both interested in the specificity of those people you worked with and what might resonate with them specifically, but also what kind of lessons might be learned for strategy generally to convince people of degrowth, basically, and or specific policies that might be worth highlighting or something like that.
I think one thing, so now, well, first I talk a little bit about the movements and the people that I was speaking with during my PhD in India, and then I can think a little bit more together on Europe. So in India, it was surprising, but also not so surprising, to know that there was so much awareness that the policies which were in place was not enough or was superficial. So there was a lot of awareness about that. So for example, if they said that a new mine would be generating so much employment or would be bringing in so much revenue to the village, they would look at the numbers and they would say, but this is not going to happen. They were going to open some jobs for people to work as like the security people, or for people to be doing the cleaning of the mines. And once that's done, after 10 years, there wouldn't be any job. And because of the mines, everything would be polluted, and we wouldn't also be able to grow agricultural to grow any kind of food, and also the promises that they're making for relocation and compensation. We have seen how it's happened in other places around us, and this is also not going to come. This is also not going to happen. So what they were asking was for, and this is where it gets tricky, because in India, unfortunately, the laws are quite in favor of the people, especially in areas, especially with so there are like two kinds of laws, two kinds of places, the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule, and there are two different types of categories of indigenous land. And in those places, it is the people who have the right to decide what to do with the land. The problem comes in the implementation phase, because then there are different ways in which the companies, using direct and indirect violences, threats, do not allow for these, do not follow these laws, and kind of shorthand them, like not give them what is constitutionally provided to, mandated for them, and then also force them, or like divide the village or divide the community in ways in which certain sections get benefits, the other don't. So then there is clash or conflict within the villages. So the specific degrowth policies, I cannot think of specific, like one particular degrowth policy, but if we think of basic policies, of people getting to decide what they want to do with their land, people getting to have jobs which are worthy or meaningful jobs, and not this kind of temporary seasonal jobs of guarding the mines, and then after a few years it's gone once the initial setup is done. So to think of those kind of things, so to think of worthy sustainable jobs, to think of knowing that there wouldn't be enough polluted land and water in the area so that people can actually live healthy lives, and to think of people having autonomy and decentralized decision making for them in their areas to know what they want to do. I think these would be policies which would be very concrete with what degrowth talks about. And then coming to the detachment with the European working class, I think here this is a failure of the degrowth movement so far to not engage as much, and I think we're trying to do this now in Barcelona, to engage more and more with unions, and to engage more and more with what are the ways in which you can think of a degrowth future where the working class is together deciding these things, because there is always this divide between environment versus jobs, and these are not real divides, like these divides get created also based on who gets to decide and who gets to theorize. And I think what degrowth needs to do is really engage with people and learn from them, and listen to them, and try to see what would be the policies which would make sense for the working class here in Europe as well.
Thank you. There's the question by Yang about indexes. Yang, can you pose it, or should I?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned that we shouldn't look at GDP. Of course, some scholars would argue, okay, we can look at GDP per capita, or we can look at purchasing power, or we can look at things beyond GDP, but measuring environmental performance. Therefore, there are multiple indexes on poverty, on environmental aspects. I wonder how these indexes that measure a country's performance at a global level are perceived by the degrowth scholars. And if you also encourage the use of these indexes. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very interesting question to think about, because then once you start looking at the indexes, you have to go a little bit deeper and see what is it that the indexes are made up of, no? And what are the things that the indexes are calculating? So the Human Development Index, for example, still has a large proportion, which is the GDP. But there are other indexes which are, so there are different ways in which you can look at different indexes and see what works and what doesn't work. If you look at some degrowth scholars who do more quantitative work, so for example, to look at unequal exchange, they then engage with World Bank data, and they look at those indexes to look at the numbers. But I don't think there is any consensus within degrowth scholars of like what is a good index, which is the index that we would follow. So I'm trying to think there are certain statistical analysis which maybe uses, I'm trying to think of one which used this index of democracy. So kind of trying to look at what is the correlation between the ranking of countries based on their democratic freedom and GDP, but then there are like different, looking at what, depending on what you're looking at, different ways, different indexes to look at.
Yeah, is that the Global Governance Index just from the World Bank, maybe? I wasn't sure about it, but yeah, you're right. I think many of these indexes also correlate with at least per capita GDP. So that's something that puzzles me. So yeah, thanks for the answer. Thanks.
There is one thing, if you're interested in this multi-criteria analysis or MUSIASM. So there they use, and if you want, I can share some papers with you. So there they use different criteria to measure something. And this is being developed by this research group of Mario Giampietro. And they have been working on this for quite a while. MUSIASM it's called.
Okay, thank you. We'll check it out. There is another question by Joanna that cannot say, so I will read it. So she actually brings forward the very positionality of us as academics within this debate, which I have to say it's a very important issue. So yeah, so what is the academia that the most, let me put it this way. I work in a department that is geography, planning, and international development studies, right? So, and there is this natural tendency to divide the research areas into global north, global south. It's just institutionalized, right? So the global south, even if it's planning or geography, goes into international development studies. I'm putting it very stereotypical, but in practice, that's what happens. So there is this institutionalization of this idea. And moreover, we tend to travel all over and trying to build development schemes that travels all over the world. So how do you see the role of research, even degrowth research, on this, on the reproduction of this divide, if it even makes sense?
Big question, huh?
Only big questions here.
I think, yeah, I mean, it's very good to be having these these discussions. So academia, unfortunately, is still very colonial, and this percolates also to degrowth. And this you can see once you start looking at who is being read, who is being referred to, who is being cited. So this is the first, what is the theory and which part becomes case studies or which part becomes examples of sustaining the theory. You start to see the coloniality of knowledge. And then this, yeah, it's very funny, and there are so many examples. It's not funny, it's quite sad actually, but there are so many examples in which you encounter this colonial setup, as you were mentioning, Federico, in like practically also know what gets divided and who gets to decide what gets divided. So that's there, and that's there in degrowth too. I mean, when I first started looking at the degrowth literature, it also felt for me very like tokenizing of global South ideas, very tokenizing of like taking certain case studies and taking certain concepts and kind of again doing this theorizing from Europe. But I think this is where also my reflections come in a little bit, no? That this idea of degrowth is not a brand new idea. Like if you look at the core of what degrowth talks about is not something which was developed here 30 years ago. Many people have been speaking about it for many years. And this is the way in which we can break this divide, and this is the way in which we can try to first have more voices and perspectives from the global South. So not just like pick certain scholars or certain names from the global South and say, oh, this person was also talking about something similar, and hence degrowth is also decolonial. No, it needs to go much beyond that. And here I'm being critical from somebody who's within the movement, no, and somebody who is, yeah. So this is like a self-reflection and being like self-critical of how degrowth still needs to do a lot to break away from the colonial logic. Taking into account ecological impacts of traveling. So there are multiple ways to think about it. Now I can give you a very nice and happy example, which is that we had the summer school in Barcelona last week, and this week we have around 40 people who are going from Barcelona. They first took the train, and then they're going to bike for 5 days through Galicia, meeting with local movements there and talking to people there, and then finally arriving to the conference in Pontevedra. This is one very nice way of arriving to a degrowth conference. But this is unfortunately not something that everyone can do. And at the same time, it is not something that so here comes the question of what you can do as individual and what you need to think about as more structurally, no? So as individuals, a lot of us in the degrowth circles are quite aware of the issues of flying, or of the issues of like jumping from one place to another and like staying somewhere for 3 days, attending a conference and coming back, totally not being in touch with the reality of a place. And a lot of people do not do that. But at the same time, to also know that individual flying is not the main, like the highest carbon dioxide emissions in terms of flying comes from the military industrial complex and not from individual people flying. So there are like these two ways to look at things. One is what you want to take in as your individual responsibility of not flying. I think conferences, these kind of crazy conferences where like 500 people meet for 3 days in some exotic location in some tropical country and talk about degrowth, is something which degrowth doesn't stand for. And then at the same time to also be aware that who are the main culprits of rising carbon dioxide emissions. So these would be like the two things to think of.
Thank
And
you.
I think I would leave it at that, yeah.
So on that note, let's go back to the billionaires, because I forgot the question by Frank. I'm sorry, Frank. He asked in India, so what is the role of philanthropy of billionaires in India in keeping basically the system as it is? Is there any information on that? How does philanthropy work in this scheme of things that you presented?
Well, the best example of great philanthropy work which happens in India is that of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And there is a lot of report which spoke about how they had all these vaccines and medicines which were extremely unethically done and what happened to and done in rural parts of the country and what happened to that. There is a very interesting book also which talks about how much billionaires get back from philanthropy, from doing philanthropy. And if I remember the name, I will share it with you. And now I'm thinking of also a little bit like non-academic sources. There was a very good episode by this comedian called John Oliver on philanthropy and how philanthropy does not do what it claims to do on the outside. Now, in terms of Indian philanthropists, so there is this, I will focus a little bit more on the examples or on the cases that I know more. There is this idea of the corporate social responsibility, that every big company which is doing any extractive project needs to do corporate social responsibility. And a lot of these companies use that or call that as their philanthropic work, which ideally it's not. It's not philanthropic work. It's something that you are supposed to be doing for the destruction that you're causing. But the ways in which they are doing that also is, for example, so I'm thinking of a specific example, this specific place that I went to, and I was visiting some of these residential schools for women and talking to the headmistresses of the school to ask them what are the ways in which the companies been supporting them. And they said, yes, the companies have been sending us all these smart TVs and these like tutorials that they're making, which we can show in the class. And then I asked them, what is the medium of instruction of these tutorials? And they said it's going to be either English or Hindi. And then I asked them, what is the language that the students speak? Do they speak English? Do they speak Hindi? And they were like, no, they don't. So they are bringing in these, so they're spending a lot of money, and on paper you would say they're doing so much philanthropy, which is not even philanthropy, which is corporate social responsibility, for doing something which would be of no benefit to anyone, because people would not even understand the language in which these videos are being made and shared. So this is the thing. I think once you start looking at the reality, just looking at the papers or just looking at the reports also is not enough. Once you really go and see what is happening in the name of philanthropy or in the name of helping, then you realize the reality is much different from what is being portrayed. Political affiliations of I think that's but I think this is the way in which crony capitalism works, no? Like the capitalists, they were the ones who are here now and are benefiting from the current government, was also benefiting from the previous government. So they do not have that, the political affiliation doesn't get translated into how much support they're getting from the government.
Thank you, Brototi. There is a question about this notion of pluriverse. So the question is very short. I can read it. How much of the pluriverse ideas percolated to mainstream degrowth literature? So yeah, I'll leave it there. It's very clear.
Yeah, I think there has been a lot of things being written and spoken about for the pluriverse, no? The idea of the pluriverse, or the idea that many worlds exist in one world. And I think degrowth has always been quite open, or like quite in line with pluriversal ideas. And one book which comes to mind is this edited volume by Arturo Escobar, Ashish Kothari, Federico De Maria, Ariel Saleh, and I think Alberto Acosta, if I'm not wrong. It came out a few years ago, and it had all these different chapters with different ideas, with different worldviews for thinking of a society which is like significantly, systematically, and structurally different from the current economic structure. So I think there has always been a lot of discussions or alliances between pluriversal ideas and degrowth.
Yes, Emma, maybe you want to say the question yourself?
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Brototi, first of all, for your presentation. I was wondering, because you also touched on this point about values and sacred values, and in this world, we communicate value through numbers, economics. That always seems the method. And also a lot of social movements that bring social and ethical values or ecological are often pushed to themselves, try to put in numbers or try to create schemes, numerical ways to communicate to institutions, especially what their value is or what their work is about. So I don't know, this is a question I have, and maybe you have reflections on this. I don't have an answer, but can we, is it even possible to communicate to institutions in a way that's not economics or numbers? Should we focus on focusing on numbers, or should we find completely different ways of communicating this? I don't know if it's clear.
No, I think that's a very good question, and something which I've also been thinking about a lot. And here, this idea of doing transdisciplinary research, so doing research not just within or with different disciplines, but also beyond academia. So engaging with social movements, engaging with artists, and engaging with architects, engaging with people who are not in the academic system, and then finding different ways of doing things. One example which comes to mind is this idea of countermapping. So this idea of looking at geographies or looking at maps in a different way and putting in things like feelings, emotions, timescales, reflections, places of conflicts, places of resistance. And there has been lots of interesting work which has been done around countermapping. So that is one way of showing something without just looking at numbers. So there are many ways of showing things. Then the question is, who are the ones? What is it that you want to communicate, and who is it that you want to communicate it to? And in recent years, you also see, so this is why I also showed a little bit the comic book and the documentary, because it depends on who you are talking with, that these different ways of communication comes into play. So I would definitely, and I think it requires a little bit of thinking on what are the ways in which we can communicate, but I think it's definitely possible to communicate something without just showing the numbers or without just depending on numbers.
Thank you, Brototi. Actually, I think this last reflection is I think it's pretty good one to close the meeting, because in fact, that's maybe one of the challenges of degrowth research, to find a way to communicate society and reality in a way that is definitely not economic-centric, let's put it this way. And within degrowth, my personal frustration is that still the economic narrative is very dominant. So we'll try to change that. So I want to thank you very much, Brototi, for your presence here and for your talk and your experience. I really appreciate it. I also thank everybody for joining this meeting. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't have a clapping function, or at least not a sound function for that. And that's pretty sad, but I'm sure they appreciate it. So before we close, I just want to say that this video will be placed on the website of the Postgrowth City Coalition. If you don't know what it is, just visit it. It's postgrowthcities.com. There we put all the content and publications and videos and audios of things that we do here in Amsterdam and beyond, of colleagues also beyond Amsterdam. And yeah, that's where you will find this video. And thank you again. Thank you, everybody.
No, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. And you can write to me, you can email me if you want to talk further, if you want some resources. And yeah, it's a pity we couldn't do it in person because I got super sick, but thank you everyone for being here. Yeah.
Okay.